think I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ghana country and that sovereignty was never ceded.
Hello, my name's David Pledger. I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, where I work and live and dream. And This is Jen Mills, and we are going to present a short conversation, an in-conversation around the dynamics of the UBI in the arts sector from our different perspectives, working in this space for some years, and we're going to cover a little bit of ground. It's going to be a wide-ranging conversation, so we'll keep our eye on the clock and hope that it's worthwhile for all those that are listening. We've decided to do a sort of question. We're going to do it in conversation, so a kind of question format. So we're going to ask each other questions and answers, and then see how it goes from there. So, Jen, would you like to begin and maybe talk about?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually how the arts funding landscape has shifted over the last 40 years, and particularly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and what kind of effect that has had on working artists.
Yeah, well, I think probably I can speak reasonably well going back until 1990, so that's probably the last 30 years where there was a kind of measurement that has been sort of really kind of worked through, where from 1990 to 2010, in terms of direct funding to artists, and by direct funding I mean money that goes directly into the pockets of artists, there was a one-third decrease. So that's over a 20-year period. There was one-third less money available that was going across the arts agencies of Australia, and that was around state and national territories. And that was at a time when, obviously, real costs of living were increasing. So it didn't just drop a bit, it dropped like that. So the gap got created in that time. From 2010 to 2020, let's just say just before the pandemic, there was a period in which, and there's a statistic that was that Alison Croghan came up with and investigated. There was a 70% decrease over a period of, I think, about 6 or 7 years. So it's 70% on top of the one-third decrease over the previous 20 years. So going into the pandemic, as we know, there's been very little money that's found its way into artists' pockets. So where we are at the moment is we're largely at a stage where there is a negligible amount of taxpayers' money that is allocated to the arts ending up in the pockets of artists to make their work and to simply live, put food on the table, and to feed their families and social networks.
Yeah, there was a study, I think, that things were very bad before the pandemic, and I feel like the pandemic has just sort of cemented a lot of divisions between sort of those who are well off and those who aren't. And artists who have some inherited wealth or other means of supporting themselves are surviving, and a lot of people are burning out now that the support structures that were there for a limited time in the pandemic have gone. There was a report, I think it was 2017, David Throsby making artwork for the Australia Council, and even then, that was 5 years ago, and the Australia Council at the time said, it's increasingly difficult for artists to make a living from their work.
I think what happens also is when that happens, the artist population decreases. And so I think in the 2010s it flatlined. So historically, despite the fact that there'd been a third drop off of direct funding over 20 years, I think in that 2010s there was the artist population flatlined. So that's a real indicator, because it means that as the population of Australia is increasing, actually that becomes a small percentage of the overall working population of the country. And then I think in the last few years of the 2010s, it started to decline. And anecdotally, we many people are saying, and I'm really saying this in terms of conversations I have with colleagues in various parts of the sector, that between 15 and 20% of that artist population, which was just under 50,000, is now has now left the arts completely and gone into other industries. So it's a desperate situation for artists and the arts. And if we believe that the arts is a measure of the health of democracy, then it's a desperate situation for our social democracy. So, you know, I think you and I are looking at the problem from multiple points of view and trying to look at where the pressure points are, which is why I feel like we've come to this idea of like, what's a solution? What are the solutions here? And again, there are many, I think, but one of the ones that we've been talking about is a basic income for the arts. When you've, in your work that you're doing at the moment, you're a resident, you're at Vital Statistics, you are the, what's your actual title there now?
I'm an artist in residence there, David, and it's a really rare opportunity because the organisation, which is a radical theatre company, has employed me as an artist in residence on a salary 2 days a week. So I'm earning the same as anyone else in the organisation does. And I'm doing a lot of work for them and research into art as labour. But it's also the first time in 15 years of freelancing and writing full time that I've had sick leave and superannuation and a regular paycheck. And it's made a huge difference to my sort of my work structure. I'm not sort of panicking around paying the rent. I can accept things like, so at the moment, for example, I'm waiting on about $3,000 worth of unpaid invoices. And the pressure of having to chase that up, I could spend a day trying to chase that up before my rent is due, but because I have this regular fortnightly payment, I don't have to worry about that. So in a way, it's a little test case of a different model instead of using project funding to fund somebody on a salary. And I think it's something that should be considered by arts organisations and actually any organisation. But it's extra work because I am doing work for the organisation. So they're not just paying me to do my own creative practice. They're also paying me to work for the organisation, and some of that is documentation and research and stuff around these issues.
And so in that way, I mean, just personally, your sort of work in the space of labour and work, you know, it has an activist sort of, you know, impulse. You're writing a lot about those things. Do you feel like I look at the way that you work and how you describe yourself, and I often feel like, well, that's a very contemporary sort of description of tasks for an artist, that they need to balance their artistic practice with their activist practice, because without their activist practice, they won't be able to practice their art. And that is, the artist these days is very much, I won't say an artivist because that means something else, but you have to have those two kind of, the activist and the artist needs to sit really, you know, quite intimately in that one mind and body.
And we're under so much pressure that I honestly think if you're not an activist, then you're letting art down, because we need to create the conditions in which arts and culture can thrive in our society. That's part of being a responsible practitioner. You don't just make work for your own ego. You want to create a world in which arts and culture thrive. And that's not a box ticking grant application statement. We need to really look hard at what the conditions of our work are. Mm-hmm. You know, governments like to talk a lot about participation in the arts and well-being, but how can you encourage participation when the majority of artists are living below the poverty line? half of writers make less than $15,000 a year from their creative work. I'm one of them. And so it's, we're not creating the conditions in which people can live off their art. And far from it, people are having to go and take multiple day jobs and things. So you end up having to sort of be strategic about, well, which bits of the world do I need to change and which bits of my own practice do I need to change to survive in this?
Yeah. And so you've actually been, the stories that you get from artists, you've been interviewing quite a few artists in terms of what their own lived experience is. Is there a kind of what's the picture? What's the portrait of the artist at the moment in terms of their kind of how do they behave? What's a day look like for an artist in the stories that you've accumulated so far?
Yeah, so there is no typical day. I think everybody is sort of scrambling and hustling and trying to make it work all the time. I'm writing an article at the moment about Adhocracy, which is Vital Statistics' annual development lab for experimental art projects, and it's very collaborative and it's very exciting, and I used it as an opportunity to interview a lot of artists about these issues. And I actually have some statements that artists made to me in those interviews that I wanted to share with folks because it's very interesting to hear the testimony. One said, I have to get at least 25 jobs a year. Some of them are only $500 jobs, but I still have to apply for them. I like to have a lot of different jobs, but I have to be really careful and manage my energy. One said, constantly having to bridge the gap between projects is really stressful. The mental health impacts are huge. A lot of things come down to housing. The reliance on goodwill and unpaid labor makes it borderline impossible to keep doing this past your 20s, said one artist. Another said, our love and care for each other can make us easy to exploit. Another artist said, I see my art as a responsibility, as a form of civic participation, which comes back to what you were saying earlier, I think. People said things like grants determine the work that gets made. One artist said, my art practice basically consists of applying for grants. Another spoke about being in an artist community and said that when she was working for direct exchange of labour, she found a profound relief.
Yeah.
And a few people said something along these lines, we should fund artists, not projects.
Yeah. Yeah, which is a great lead into, a basic income for the arts and what it looks like and what it can offer, because we all know from our experience that if we have money in our pocket, artists are relentless. They're complex makers. They're compulsive often. They really, the idea that if you get a basic income for the arts, it's just going to mean that people get money to sit at home. It's completely perverse. I've never experienced in any of the systems that I've been engaged with internationally that that's ever the case. Artists want to make. They need to make. If you fund the artists rather than the projects, then you're going to get a lot of stuff that's going to get made, and the quality of it, I believe, will improve considerably, and the potential for a kind of cultural renaissance is real, and the sensibility of artists and the way in which they are perceived and operate in society improves. The way in which society actually talks about itself and talks to itself is made more generous because of the increased levels of nuance and the safe spaces that the arts creates for very difficult conversations to occur. So they're all the kinds of things that, I think are really that a basic income for the arts can achieve globally. And for artists, I feel like if you don't have to if you're in a position where you're in at the moment where you're guaranteed 2 days a week income and you can just relax, you don't have that anxiety, then the kinds of work and the way that you think and how you think and the conversations that you can have just really are much richer and much more, in some ways, I think, perhaps public facing. You know, they're actually looking at making meaning in society. So I'm not sure how you feel like what a basic income for the arts would actually impact on on the broader community.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you've said about these kind of democratic conversations that the arts make possible really resonates with me.
So how
But
would
I
we?
also think there's that question of public value. Like, how do we show our society or demonstrate as a society that we've chosen to make arts and culture one of the valuable things that we do? And the way that we've been pretending to do it is through these creative industries, treating art as an industry. But how can you have an industry where everyone's poor and broke and overworked and burning out? Like, that's not a successful industry, is it?
Yeah, yeah. The arts industry is the template for how not to create and operate an industry.
Yeah. And also how not to make art a lot of the time.
Not to make art. Yeah. I mean, that point that artist was saying about, I basically make art according to what the criteria. I call that application art.
Mm.
And I think application art is what predominates, in this place that we live in. Really, that's people are actually making application art. They're not making the art that they feel needs to be made. They're making the art that they feel they can get funded to make, and that's incredibly problematic. And it makes that process of across the board, socially and mechanically, as a transaction. And when art becomes a transaction, then it starts to lose its soul and its efficacy and its agency and its spirit. And we need more of that at the moment. I guess before we finish up, maybe we should just try and work our way through how do we think? What projects might we kind of think about that can kind of enable a basic income for the arts?
Yeah, look, I'm watching Ireland very closely, the trial that's just started there, which has 2,000 practicing artists now enrolled in a basic income scheme. I do think that we can actually achieve a lot of what we want to achieve by getting rid of mutual obligation and increasing the dole to a living wage standard, or even just a livable standard. Because it used to be, I think, the case, well before I was a writer, unfortunately, but I think it used to be the case that artists could get by on the dole and make the kind of art they wanted to make. And that kind of shift would not just help artists, that would help everybody.
Yep. I mean, I had Social Security for probably off and on for probably 10 years once I got out of drama school. And I made a commitment after 10 years that I wouldn't do it anymore. I was heading overseas because I got a job overseas. And from that moment on, when I made that commitment, I really became somebody who made, created and produced and also employed a lot of other artists. And I couldn't have done that without that and the initial sort of off and on for 5 to 10 years of having access to a social security that only asked limited amounts of questions about my integrity. I was committed to what I wanted to do, and I had that support. And from my own experience, I feel like that's an evidence that a social security system that has a kind of humanity at its core actually generates many more benefits in society than a social security system that really has, I don't know what you call robo-debt, but whatever that was that an evil?
Dystopian.
A dystopian, yeah, at its core. Then you get exactly the opposite. So I agree with you. I think there's certain things that, we want to put into this space where, in terms of what a solution might be. What about a pilot project?
Yeah, I think a pilot project in the arts that's looking to basic income for everybody makes a lot of sense to me because artists are very good at self-reporting. We like to be experimented on, and we could also have a lot of fun with the kind of art that we make, and produce conversations out of the experience. Do what art does best: stimulate thought and discussion and ideas. I do think though that um, basic income shouldn't just be for artists. It shouldn't be a different form of arts funding. It shouldn't replace project funding or fair pay in the arts, which is a really important thing to fight for. But it could enable us to dedicate some of our time to the kind of collaboration and organising that is often unpaid work that we do, and the care work that we do for each other as well in the arts, which has been so important over the last couple of years.
Yeah. I think thinking about a basic income for the arts in a kind of rhizomatic way is it's one of a number of things that needs to be put in place if we're to retain the artist population and if we're to increase it, and if we're able to kind of respect labour, that a BIA is one of a number of measures that we need to do. It's not to replace something, but it is a big and, I feel, to what is already there. And hopefully by doing that, you change the conversation around the basic value of the arts, which is intrinsic to all of the things that we've been discussing, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can open that out further to have broader conversations, more utopian conversations about, why do we work the way that we do? What does hyper productivity achieve? And how can we make an economy based on creativity more of a degrowth economy or a circular economy? We've really got to rethink labour more broadly, and artists are going to be able to open ways into that conversation for everybody.
Yes. Such rich material for artists to work in, and they're already working in those spaces. But for that to be to come out and be made more available and public and a bigger part of the conversation, is something that will be problematic if we don't do it. And if we do it, then things can happen quite quickly, I think, in that space, because language is the key. Language creates momentum in that space. So it means that if it's allowed to be freed into that space, then things can happen quite quickly. So I don't know, I'm optimistic.
Well, you're an expert in this field of art and social change, David, and I feel more optimistic when I speak to you about it as well.
Thanks, Jen. That was a good chat. I guess we're close to the end of our time, so maybe we should just wave and say hello back to people in the room. And
yeah, I'm happy to wrap it up there. I hope it's been useful for everybody. I look forward to listening to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.